Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sound Stewardship's webinar on the college search process. I'm Derek Hensley, one of the wealth advisors at Sound Stewardship. Sound Stewardship is a fee-only financial planning and wealth management firm in Overland Park, Kansas. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Cozy Wittman as our speaker. Cozy is an education and partnership leader at College Inside Track. She speaks nationally about college search, educating families, and training financial advisors and other professionals who work with families with high schoolers. College search has become increasingly complex with the nuances hard to understand. Cozy is passionate about dispelling myths that cost families money. She was featured in the Journal of Financial Planning on the subject of college planning. Cozy is excited to connect with organizations and families interested in learning more about the complex college search process. She's a mom of 5 kids with very different goals for college, so she's no stranger to the challenges around the college search. Cozy, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me, Derek. It's my pleasure. And a huge thank you for you guys carving out some of your time to join us today. We're going to talk about some of the major changes that are coming that you would need to incorporate as part of your search process in 2023, but this will probably fall into 2024 and 2025. So if you have a high schooler today, you're in the right place. If you're unfamiliar, College Inside Track has been helping families navigate college search for now 17 years, actually. I need to change my slide. We do help families identify right fit schools. We would categorize that as the right academic fit for your student, the right social fit for your student, and the right financial fit for your family. And then part of our job is just to reduce the stress between parents and kids. I do want to say we are going to take questions. I'm happy to take your questions today. And so as we go through, if you just want to drop your question into the Q&A, you find that in your toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And then I'm going to pause periodically through the presentation. So don't be shy, put your questions in there, and I'll look forward to answering them for you. We're going to start today with a quiz. Let's see how much you know about college today. As a percentage, how much has tuition increased nationally at our public institutions? So these are our state colleges and universities since 1990, so over the last 30 years. Have our tuitions gone up 73% at these institutions, 106%, 180%, or 213%? So I'll give you a hot second to figure out which you think is true. Our public schools have actually increased their tuitions by 213% on average nationally. By comparison, we see private schools having gone up 415% in that same time frame. But hold on, before you get out your wet noodles and start lashing those private schools for that outrageous increase, I want you to take a quick peek at our public flagship universities. So these are the major university in your state. You can see University of Kansas sitting at 641% in the last 30 years. I live up in Minnesota. We're up at 570. And then you can see the 2 big dogs of the Big Ten sitting at 1,047%, my neighbors to the east in Wisconsin. And then University of Michigan has actually increased their tuition by 1,053%. Highest I found so far is UConn on the East Coast. University of Connecticut has increased their tuition by 1,300% in the last 30 years. So these guys, these flagship schools, far outpacing their other public peers, but they have also doubled or tripled the amount that those private schools have gone up. So I think it's really important to understand that the landscape has really changed here. I want to give you a little state of the state of college land today. I want to point out that one school has finally tipped the scales, NYU, going over the $90,000 a year mark. And then I want you to note the top few schools here. When I sit down and I chat college with families, I often ask the student, tell me some schools you're kind of sort of interested in. And guess what? One of those top four almost always comes into the conversation. I have yet to meet a student who wouldn't like to explore Colorado as an option. So I've got a school from there. And then at the bottom here, I just want to point out, I just randomly chose 3 flagship schools. If these are the flagship schools of their state, so the big dog public institution. And I just want you to note that they are all sitting solidly over $30,000 a year. And back when we started our college searches, I told my kids, I don't care where you go as long as you stay in the state and go to a state school, because I presumed that was always going to be the least expensive option. And it turns out, guess what? It's not always. I don't know about you guys, but I don't think about $40,000 a year as an inexpensive education. So I think it's important today to really kind of ditch old world thinking, and we're going to talk more about that later. In the meantime, I have another quiz for you. What percentage of students change schools at least one time? So go off to college, discover that they are in the wrong place and have to change schools. Is it 6%, 14%, 25%, 38%, or 42%? Today, the national transfer rate sits at 38%. So almost 40% of kids make a poor choice. Why am I randomly bringing this up? Here's why, because there's an actual cost to that change. And so if your student changes schools, just goes from one public institution to another public institution, it actually does increase the cost of the degree by about $14,000. And if the student decides, oh shoot, I don't really like this school either. And guess what? Of the 38% who change schools once, almost half of those kids, 45%, change schools yet again. And that increases the cost of the degree by $24,000. So today, it is so important to choose the right school the first time and just stay there. All right, we're going to talk about the different kinds of aid available to families who have kids going off to school. And one of the things I want to start to clarify is, what do colleges actually mean when they talk about financial aid? Because here's what I have found. Most families don't understand how financial aid works, and they don't understand the definitions of the different forms. And so I want to walk you through these so that you understand the distinction. When colleges talk about financial aid, they are incorporating multiple things. They're not just talking, which is how most families define it, about need-based aid. That is not the only definition of financial aid. Need-based aid is a specific form of financial aid. It comes to the family usually in the form of a grant, or it could come to the family in the form of a scholarship, because some schools call their need-based aid scholarships. When colleges talk about financial aid, they are also talking about merit-based scholarships. So these are scholarships your student gets from the college because the college is interested in the student. And we're going to spend a lot of time differentiating these in a second. And then a lot of schools, guess what? Also mean loans. So when they talk about financial aid, they are incorporating all 3 of these. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't think about loans as aid, because you have to pay that back. Grants and scholarships, you do not. Right? But the colleges just kind of slam all of that together. It can be very confusing for families. So we're going to start by talking about need-based aid. This is one form of financial aid. There are 2 forms that you might fill out to determine if you have need at a college. Most people are familiar with the first one. It's the FAFSA, of course. Most are not familiar with the second. It is called the CSS profile. Not everybody uses the CSS profile, so you may never see this. These 2 forms kick out an output of determination of need. And that output is called the Student Aid Index. Now, if you have older students, you might be familiar with the terminology expected family contribution. That verbiage got thrown away yesterday. It actually, for the 2024 FAFSA, got tossed out, and the new verbiage now going forward the output of the FAFSA and the CSS profile are going to be called the Student Aid Index. So my first tip for you today, and there are going to be 4 of these. So my first tip is get a FAFSA forecast tool. I have found, I sit down with families, I chat college with them every single day. What I have found is people are very poor predictors of whether they will qualify for need-based aid. Most people are pretty sure they're not going to qualify at the federal level. Probably true. You have to have a pretty low household income to qualify there. However, the colleges are going to make their own determination of need, right? So get a FAFSA forecast tool, understand what your potential for need is, and then maybe you make adjustments, maybe you don't, right? Maybe you chat with Derek and his team, or maybe you don't. But it's important to know how the FAFSA breaks down different kinds of assets. The first thing I want to point out is that children's assets are assessed at 20%. So if you have college savings sitting in an UGMA or an UTMA form, that is considered a student asset. It goes on the student side of the equation. Parents are also assessed on the FAFSA, and today you really cannot do that. I'm just not going to claim you on my taxes, then you're an independent student. That's not a thing. That is not a legal way to define independence today. And parent assets are only assessed at 5.64%, teeny tiny assessment. It would include any 529 plans you have, and it would include the Coverdell if you have that educational savings plan. So this is good news, right? Because remember, a 529 plan, 100% of that is intended for use for education, but it's only going to be assessed at this teeny tiny 5.64%. So there are 2 giant mistakes that we see that people make on their FAFSA, and I want you to avoid these. The first is people assume that assets are a major influencer. They are not. Again, only 5.64%. Your income by comparison as a parent is going to be assessed at 47%. So the formula presumes you can send 47% of your income off with your student to go to college. Most of us would consider that a ridiculous number, of course. The other big mistake that we see that people make is that they assume their retirement accounts in their home are going to be included in the FAFSA, and they are not. Your primary residence and your retirement accounts are not accounted for on the FAFSA at all. And the new FAFSA doesn't even ask you to add back in your 401k contributions, where the old one did. So just know, retirement not considered. Parent income is the single largest factor on the FAFSA. So don't call up Derek and say, okay, we need to ditch assets right away. Because for the vast majority of you, if you're going to be knocked out of the potential for need, it is going to be on your income, not on your assets. So I mentioned there's some major changes to the FAFSA. I want to walk you through these changes. The first I mentioned already, the verbiage expected family contribution is getting retired, and starting with the 2024 FAFSA, which we believe will be available in December this year, December of 2023. So if you have a rising senior, a student who's going to be a senior this fall, you'll get access to that FAFSA this December. Normally that FAFSA is available in October. So if you have younger students, anticipate that FAFSA will be available to you starting in October of the student's senior year. So the first major change coming to the 2024 FAFSA is that families will no longer have the ability to take into account how many kids they have in college at once. It's not going to impact the outcome of your FAFSA. So traditionally, what's happened on the FAFSA is there's a place where you indicate how many students you have in college at the same time, and then the formula takes that into account. And in essence, for instance, with your income, if you had 2 kids in college, it would split that 47% assessment, and 23.5% would be assessed to student A and 23.5% to student B. The new FAFSA formula doesn't do that. So when you fill out student A's FAFSA, it's going to assess your income at 47%. And when you fill out student B's FAFSA, 47%. So in essence, if you have multiple kids in college, it is going to mean that they assume you can send 94%, or if you have 3, it's 47% times 3. I don't know what that number is. Big, more than 100% for sure. So just know this could have real impact on families, mostly in the middle income and upper middle income class, because those were the families who traditionally would qualify for need-based aid once they had 2 kids in college or more. The divorce formula is also changing. So no longer will you take into account where the student lives. So when you have divorce as part of your family structure, only one parent's going to fill out that FAFSA form. It used to be determined by where the student lived. It will now be determined by who is supporting that student, 51% financially. So financial determinations. It does not connect who is claiming that student as a dependent, right? So whoever's claiming that student as a dependent is irrelevant on your taxes. Instead, it is whoever is financially supporting that student more. This is self-reported, is what I'll say. The exemptions for small businesses and farming is going away. So now you'll have to include the value of all assets associated with that business. So if you have unsold merchandise, you own your building, if you're a farmer and you have farmland, equipment, all of that will have to be included in the FAFSA form. And then the one positive change, a lot of these were negative impacts to families, but the one positive impact to families is that grandparents, aunties, uncles, godparents, anybody who wants to help the student pay for school can now do so, and it will no longer impact the student's potential for need-based aid. All right, I want to pause there before we jump into other things financial and just see if we have any FAFSA questions, Derek.
Yeah, let me look here. And so, yeah, one question is, should we still fill out FAFSA if we won't be need-based?
Yeah, this is a good question. The short answer to that question is it depends. But here's what I'm going to tell you. 2 things. One, if you want to take advantage of the federal student loan, you have to fill out your FAFSA. It's the application for the loan. And the second thing I want to point out, we're going to talk about this more here in a couple of slides, but a lot of schools add scholarship money to a package just because people fill it out. So we encourage everybody to fill it out. One of the other things that we saw in the last couple of years were schools where the student had delayed financial award packages because the family had not filled out their FAFSA. We even saw schools where it kind of looked like a student didn't get accepted. And we saw that at more than one school because the family opted out of filling out their FAFSA. So we recommend people just fill it out. Today, it's not going to take you very long. It's either 30 or 36 questions and you're done. So it's getting simplified pretty considerably.
Let me see. I don't think there's any more FAFSA questions that have come through yet.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Folks, don't be shy. Feel free. Drop your questions in because I'm happy to answer them. This is your chance.
Yep.
And if you think of one later, drop it in. We'll come back and readdress for sure. All right, so let's move on then. I have one last quiz for you. What school path do you think is the least expensive? Choosing a 4-year public institution, starting at a 2-year and transferring to any kind of 4-year college, starting at a public college and then transferring to a private college, or starting at and finishing at a 4-year private university. So I'll give you a second. This quiz is a little wordier to choose your answer. And it was kind of a trick question. All the above are true. Any of those pathways could be the least expensive pathway. It depends on the student and the circumstances, right? So here's the deal though. I just want to point out that transfer rate and the increase in the cost of the degree. right? So this increased cost often makes the transferring option of those options the more expensive option, even if your credits are less expensive at that first school. You no longer hold value to the school. They no longer see you as value-based because once you become a transfer student, they cannot count you in their four-year graduation rates. So now you're just a student taking up space on their campus, right? They can't count you in the metrics that matter to them. And this is the part of the presentation where I ask you to put on your business hats and remember that colleges are businesses. And when they accept students, it's a business choice. And when they give students money, it is a business choice, right? I think we do a lot of our search as families with our heartstrings. Colleges are not doing it with their heartstrings, right? So this is the part where we have to start to put on our business hats. I really want you to ditch old world thinking. It is not going to suit you well in the current landscape. The college environment is not meant to be thought of any longer as public and private, expensive, more expensive. Instead, you want to think about schools as being flexibly priced or inflexibly priced, because at the end of the day, there are public and private schools on both sides of that equation, right? So if you live in Kansas and your student wants to go to Michigan, you are going to pay every penny at University of Michigan of $72,000, every penny. And your student might get some merit money. Let's call it $1,000 because that's a huge award at University of Michigan, huge. So congrats, you're now paying $71,000. By comparison, Eastern Michigan does not charge in-state, out-of-state. That's not a thing they do. If your student wants to go off to NYU, you will pay every penny of $90,000 a year. But if they're interested in Drake, your number is going to look more like 36,000, right? So I think it's important now to get rid of the old way we used to think about this. And I had to do it too, right? You remember what I told my kids, go anywhere you want as long as you stay in the state of Minnesota and go to a public institution. And it turned out, when I look at the 3 traditional college searches we did, because we did 2 kind of non-traditional, one of my kids went to our in-state flagship, one of ours went to a private, and one of ours went to an out-of-state state school. She actually went to UMKC. The least expensive on that list was the private school, followed by the out-of-state state school, and lastly by our flagship university. So get rid of the way that you have traditionally thought about pricing for colleges because it just doesn't fit the narrative anymore. Scholarships are the keys to bringing down that money, or excuse me, bringing down the cost. So I want to help you understand where you find that money. All of the notable will change the price of college scholarship dollars are sitting in the colleges. You just have to choose the right ones. As mentioned, if a Kansas student wants to go off to University of Michigan, Michigan has $1,000, maybe a couple $100 for them, if they give anything at all, because they give a lot of students nothing, right? So you have to be smart about this. You have to understand the incentive to schools to give away cash. And if I'm a big brand school, there is not incentive there, right? So aligning who your student is with schools that fit their academic goals, their social goals, and your family's financial goals is the key to bringing down the cost of college, if that's important to you. Now, I know some of you maybe have saved well, or you're a high net worth family. That's awesome. And the cost is not such a driver for you. Great. But for families for whom it is, the way that you reduce that cost is by looking at schools who can help you get there. And so it's important to align who your student is with schools that would be interested in them. When colleges give away money, they give it away traditionally for all 4 years. So this is a top place to get money, really, really important. And how you do your search is going to impact that outcome. After your student gets accepted, Again, there are additional opportunities here. So your student will get an email that says, congrats, you're a bear, a beaver, a gopher, an eagle, a duck, or some other woodland creature. And in that email, there's a link to additional scholarship dollars. Kids miss these all the time because they are not good email readers, right? They haven't learned yet. If colleges sent those by texts, they get them like this, right? But they don't. And so kids miss these deadlines all the time. So the colleges themselves are your source of scholarship dollars. They are number one on the list and number two on the list because, again, they give it away in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions every single year. And then it does typically last all 4 years. Number three on the list would be some of these local scholarships. These are fine, right? You just have to know they are not going to move the needle on the price of college. So, congrats, you got the Rotary Scholarship for $700. Maybe the employer has one for $500. So the student now has, $1,200 they're bringing with them to college. Congrats, you bought books, it's not taking $30,000 and chopping it down, really. So should they apply? 100%. Just don't count on it to really push that needle very far. And then the bottom of the barrel, I always tell families, there is no magic rainbow of scholarships, right? The private scholarships that sit out on the internet are a waste of your time. Do not spend your time and your energy looking for private scholarship dollars. So if the colleges are the source, then what are you actually looking for? Well, the first thing I want to point out is you have to look at schools that actually offer merit aid. Again, the schools need some incentive to give it away. And if I'm Columbia and I had 175,000 applicants last year, I'm Johns Hopkins, I had 100,000 applicants last year, UCLA, 150,000 applicants last year, Clemson had 74,000 applicants last year. There's no incentive for those schools to give away cash. They don't have to. They can fill their freshman class 20 times over, right? With great students. So I think it's really important to understand if a school has an acceptance rate that sits under 20%, there really is no money available to your student. Oh, and by the way, I know everybody's neighbor's cousin's son's kid got a full ride at Harvard. I am telling you that kid is urban legend. They may have gotten some money there. It was need-based, so you cannot make presumptions that you would get that money. And guess what? The super selective schools in the country do this really snazzy thing where they call their need-based money scholarships. Why do they do it? It's purposeful. It's marketing. It's marketing for them. Because if your next door neighbor kid got a scholarship from Harvard and your kid is looking at them going, I have a better GPA than that kid has. How is that possible? I'm going to apply to Harvard. Guess what? Harvard gets more applicants, pushes down their acceptance rates, all better for Harvard. It does not benefit the students, though. So I think it's really important to understand the marketing engines on those selective schools, really, really, really heavy in motion. So once you understand whether or not a school can bring merit aid to the table, then you need to understand what they're looking for. The first thing they're thinking about, of course, is how can your student help us with our average incoming GPA and our test scores? So they are looking for kids that are sitting in the upper quadrants of their average incoming student. So you need to understand what is the average incoming GPA and test score for this school and where does my student align? Extracurricular talents matter, but more is not better. More is not better, right? Deep dive is better. Your kid should not go learn to play tuba just to look for scholarship dollars because they think that's going to look good on their resume. It's so much more important to do things that matter to your student and then just tell your story well. Be demographically interesting. This is so easy to do, and most of us, including me, cut our kids off from this. You are more interesting out of your region than in your region, because guess what? UMKC gets the vast majority of their applicants right from the Kansas City area. University of Kansas gets most of their applicants from Kansas. University of Minnesota gets most of their applicants from Minnesota, right? This is true for all of the schools, right? Most kids do not wander further than about 100 miles from their house. So you are more interesting just by going further afield than staying closer to home. And a lot of schools will bring value to the table because you did that. So I want to walk you through that. So let's talk about what this looks like. How are schools building scholarship packages? I want to give you the recipe for how they think. So the first area that they are looking at is something called demonstrated interest. This is the school's perception of how interested your student is in them. So how much interest your student showed the school brings value to the table. Look at this, just for living out of state, they are bringing anywhere from 2 to 15. So if you're a rare student, they don't see very many of you in their state, lots more money, because every school wants to say they've got one kid from all 50 states and 37 countries around the world. For every A on the transcript, $62. So they literally assign a dollar amount to A's. They assign a dollar amount to rigorous classes. A great letter of recommendation, which means your kid needed to ask the teacher more than a day before it was due, $1,800. For every point above this school's ACT score that your student score is, they are giving $425 per point at this school. It varies, of course, school to school. But I want to point out here that this particular school where this recipe was plucked, this particular school has been test optional for 10 years. So just because a school is test optional does not mean that they don't care about the test. I think that's really important to understand. So here's a good example. Why should you fill out your FAFSA even if you're not going to get need-based aid? This school brings money to the table just because you did. This school is also a CSS profile school, $2,500 here. And a really well-written essay. A lot of schools around the country can be worth 8, 9, 10,000 additional scholarship dollars. So I think it's really important to spend some time. The essay and their application are not check the box moments. We spend a ton of time with the students we work with, helping them really distinguish themselves in that essay and the application. All right, let's go through this next round of tip, and then we'll pause and take your questions. So if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A right now. Testing still matters. This is my second tip. Plan appropriately. It would have been lovely if COVID would have kicked all testing off the planet and nobody had to worry about testing anymore. That is just not true, right? SAT or ACT, the colleges view these equally. They do not care. The rule around like, oh, if you're going coastal, you have to do the SAT. And if you're staying in the Midwest, ACT is gone, right? It doesn't matter. The schools don't care. They are more interested in you having a score. So the student can actually choose the test that serves them best. You should know the PSAT is going digital this fall. The PSAT determines national merit scholars. It will be 100% digital starting this fall. And then after the turn of the year, the SAT will go digital as well. And you won't have an option for a handwritten or a fill in the circles test. It's a really interesting test. It kind of learns about the student as it goes and adjusts appropriately. It's been being rolled out internationally for several years now, and they are finally going to introduce it into the US. But you should figure out which of the tests fits you best, fits your student best, and then make the right decision, because it doesn't make any difference, again, to the schools. Get prep that fits you. There's good online sources for test prep, individual tutors, of course, and then there are group learning centers. Just use the version that fits your student best, how they learn and how they take in information. And then you can make decisions about whether or not you're going to send the test along after you've gotten a couple of tests well prepped, taken. Once you have a score, then you can make decisions about whether or not you send it. But just not taking it because you just are going to apply to all test optional schools. It's such a moving landscape today. And the other thing I'm going to say about the testing space is there are a lot of schools that plaster test optional all over their websites. And then behind the scenes, we can see that they are accepting students at much higher rates with test scores than not. So not everybody's a great test taker. It doesn't have to be your shiny moment. But don't make the mistake of just assuming that the schools don't care. All right, before I jump into trends, Derek, do we have any questions?
Yes. Alrighty. One question came through is, when is the best time for a high schooler to start the college search process?
Yeah, I love this question. So I recommend let them get sophomore year under their belt, right? Let them get like first semester kind of roll in, and then start doing high level easy stuff, right? So just get on some campuses. They don't even have to be formal tours, and please don't put any pressure on how much do you love the school? Do you think you might want to apply? Right? I just want them to go see a big school and then go see a small school. And you could also talk about the environment that school sits in. Like, is it urban or is it a small town? So just have those early discussions. So starting kind of second half of sophomore year is ideal.
And then we kind of talked a little bit about some of these schools that are test optional. Do you think test optional schools, like, do you think that will remain in place for most schools, or what do you think is going to happen with that?
Yeah, so we're already seeing a lot of the flagship schools and the state public institutions. So for the class of 2023, Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas went back to test required. For the class of 2024, we saw a couple other, I forget which states, some of the steel belt states jump back in. And now for 2025, we're seeing more public schools. So Indiana is jumping back into that space. Kentucky is stepping back in. So my gut is once we tip that first domino and a state said, we're going to start requiring this again, it's going to start to fall, right? Now, some schools, and this might surprise people to know, there were more than 1,000 schools in the country who were test optional pre-COVID. So about a third of the schools in the country. So testing is important, but if you're the parent of a student who has severe test anxiety, then we also don't believe in beating students up with the standardized testing, right? There's no good reason to torture your kid through this. And so instead, we think about things like application boosters. If testing is not going to be your shiny moment, let's make something else the shiny moment, right? And it's easy to do.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, I think that's all the questions for now around the testing and the test optional.
Sounds good.
Good.
All right, let's talk about the trends. I think it's important. These are definitely trends from the last 2 years. We anticipate that they will continue forward into 2024 and 2025. The first thing I mentioned is test optional. The test optional landscape is driving other interesting changes, right? So what happened with test optional, in the first couple of years, we saw the same number of kids applying to way more schools. And then in 2022, we saw an interesting shift. We saw that trend continue, but then guess what? New players got into the market, kids that maybe thought, well, I don't even have a shot at college because I can't do test prep. And so more kids entered the marketplace who wouldn't have traditionally looked at four-year university. So now we see a higher volume of applicants. We've, and I'll talk more about kind of the numbers here in a second. But what's happened because of the increased volume of applicants is that the shift toward early decision, a lot of schools are shifting and taking more students out of the early decision pool. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because if you apply to a school early decision, you are telling them, I love you so much, I am coming no matter what. And once you put in the no matter what piece, guess what? They don't feel compelled to give you money. They don't have to. You just told them you're coming, right? And so consequently, when you apply early decision, you see that you usually are going to pay more. The scholarship package is not nearly so good for those kids. But they've confirmed their spot if they get in, right? So It's a big plus for the school. And in some cases, it's also a big plus for the students. But if you're going to use this, you want to use it in the right place. Wake Forest took 58% of their freshman class out of early decision. Cornell only took 10, right? So you want to use this in the right place. Those increased applicants are also creating an issue where a lot of our tier twos, these would be Boston College, BU, Tulane, Tufts, Case Western, Wake Forest, all of that style of school. Baylor falls into that category. It's getting harder and harder to get into those schools because of the volume of applicants, which means the complexity of getting in, meaning the things you have to do to be interesting to those schools, is also shifting and changing. And what we see is that kids have to do a lot more eyeball popping projects to be interesting to those schools. We continue to see secondary factors influencing acceptance, things like what you said in your essay, how you represent yourself on your application, the rigor level of your transcript, all of those things playing a much higher role in the acceptance process. And then with all that's happening, lots of people are wondering about pricing. And what I would just say is, for the schools for whom they have been flooded, they are not giving away so much scholarship. We have watched over the last 2 years scholarship dollars dry up at Boston College, Boston University, Northeastern, lots of the East Coast schools, but also schools where there used to be, Tulane is a great example. They used to give away great money, and we just don't see it going out the door anymore because they don't have to. But here's the good news. That is only about a third of the schools. There are 2/3 sitting over here going, hi, it's us over here. And there are good opportunities to reduce your costs. You just have to be willing to look at schools that you maybe haven't heard of, like Quinnipiac or Lehigh or Drake, right? There are lots of schools sitting in that category. So let me give you an overview of the numbers. Applications are up by 32%. 32% in the last 3 years. That is a crazy number. The schools never see increases like that, never. Big brand schools are increasingly more challenging to get into, right? 30+% applicant increases in the tier ones. Tier ones had acceptance rates under 20%. All the Ivies fall in this category, of course: Stanford, Duke, Rice, University of Chicago, Northwestern, Johns Hopkins, all of those schools fall in that category. We've seen a 26% increase in tier twos. That should say 20 to 30% increases, not 20-5. I will make that change. So 26% in the tier twos. Those are the ones I was mentioning. Baylor falls in that, Tulane, Tufts, Case Western, all of that style of school. And then 18% across all other categories. So the schools are having a boon. And yes, lots of talk about the cliff coming because we're not having as many kids, but it's just not true right now. So that cliff doesn't help your kid if your kid is a 2024, 2025, or 2026 grad. So I think it's important to work in the world that we're currently working in. The other thing we're seeing is that the public flagship schools are increasingly harder to get into for non-residents. We see many states, North Carolina, California, have quotas for their universities on what percentage of kids can be non-residents, and they're tightening that down tighter and tighter. It's next to impossible right now to get into any of the UC schools. You will not 8% non-resident at UNC Chapel Hill. Like, it's just unheard of to get into those schools if you're not a resident. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. It's not to say don't apply. It is to say call those wildcard schools because the likelihood of acceptance is quite low. All right, so make college selection more of a business decision. I've mentioned this a couple of times, right? The colleges are thinking about it that way. I want you to put your business hats on, encourage your student to think about it that way as well. Assure the school teaches to your students' success. Sometimes I'll sit down with kids and they've got their eyes on, they'll say, I want to go to a Big Ten school, right? And it's clear in talking to the student that they are not going to benefit from class sizes. They're going to be 300 or even 40, right? College is different than high school. So you need to think about what does my student need to be successful on that campus? And then make sure you go and seek out schools that teach to that kind of learning style. Look at multiple programs available. The stats say your kid's going to change their mind. I don't care how solid they are on their degree. 80%, 80, change their degree at least one time. So just build that into your process. And then, as mentioned, I've said this several times now, the big brand selective schools need more than your student just being smart. It's not enough to be the 4.8, 36 on the ACT kid anymore. It just isn't. I would blow your mind with some of the projects that our kids who are looking at the selective schools are doing. Projects that I wouldn't think about as an adult, let alone as a high school student. So I think it's just important to understand the landscape and then just play the same game the colleges are playing. And then my last tip for you, create a family philosophy for how to pay for college. And Derek and his team would be a great opportunity to have this conversation, of course. What do I mean by that? I mean, start to create the 4-year game plan for where is money going to come from for each year. People do a lot of thinking about freshman year, but they don't think about sophomore, junior, and senior years. So make sure that you have a plan for all 4 years. Define expectations for everyone who's going to be contributing, because maybe there's a grandma or a grandpa who is also going to contribute, or an auntie. So lay down how this is going to play out. Here's what I expect of you, student. Here's what you can expect of us. Here's what grandma and grandpa are going to do. So have that conversation. And then talk about it early. The hardest thing I see is when I sit down with families, sadly, in senior year, because someone said, you should call college inside track. And we didn't talk to them before, but man, they went and toured schools, their kid fell in love, and the school is going to cost them $79,000 a year. They were not expecting that, and we cannot afford that. Now I have to figure out how to tell my crying child they can't go to the school they fell in love with. Talk about this early. Don't go test drive the Porsche if what you want to buy for your student is the Chevy Malibu, right? Because of course they're going to fall in love with a Porsche. Who wouldn't want to drive that? So think about what you're doing and have these conversations early. A little bit about what we do, and then I'll take your final questions. College is an industry, just like real estate, just like investing. And so it does take some savvy to be able to navigate it today. Families can do it on their own. People do it every single day, but often they end up costing themselves thousands of dollars trying to do it on their own. The colleges are not transparent, by the way. It's not your fault. They just aren't transparent around pricing or around acceptance. We help families navigate the entirety of the college search and application and acceptance process. We ensure families get the best pricing for the schools their student is interested in. But this is my favorite thing we do. We get to be a neutral third party, right? We get to stand solidly in the middle. I have 5 kids, 4 are girls. They have all mastered the eyeball roll, and I am never the smartest person in the room, ever. So we get to be that kind of middle person who doesn't have skin in the game, really. So here's what I would love to do for everybody who joined us today. If you're wondering about, well, how do I execute this? Let's sit down, let's have a conversation around it, right? I do free consultations every single day, bar none, my favorite thing to do. So what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to answer your questions. I start everyone the exact same way. What do you guys want to talk about? And you'll tell me what you want to talk about. We'll talk about goals and goal areas, and I'll suggest some strategies that your family can use. I can give you a rough of your FAFSA, so an estimator, if you will, of that FAFSA outcome, so you'll know. Are we going to be able to take advantage of need-based aid at some schools, or nope, we're only going to be able to take advantage of merit, or I don't care about either of those. I do care about my student finding a right fit school. How do we figure that out? So all of that is appropriate. We would cover it all. So a little bit of housekeeping here. If you have a sophomore or junior, take advantage of the hour. It's free. I have a Google form I'm going to send to Derek. I think he's going to send it out afterward. If you fill that out, my admin will get you on my calendar, and I'll look forward to having that conversation. Maybe you joined us today. You have a middle schooler and you just wanted to see what was coming down the pike. That's okay. Fill out the form. We'll call you second half of sophomore year. We're not going to call you before most students aren't ready to talk college before that. Feel free to follow our Facebook page. We put a ton of content on our Facebook page. It's just College Inside Track. on Facebook. And then share us with people you know. If you have a high schooler, you know people with high schoolers, they can take advantage of that free consultation as well. So feel free to share that Google form if you like, or you can just send them my contact information. I am always happy to sit down. I got into this because the lack of transparency in the college industry makes me crazy. I cannot stand how the process works today. It drives me nuts. So feel free to take advantage, tell your friends to take advantage. I would love to chat with you. Derek, what questions do we have?
Yeah, thank you, Cozy. So questions are coming in here. So we're, on the border of Kansas, Missouri. And so do you know in our general area, if you want to just go Midwest, but Missouri, Kansas, if you know those, what universities are more pricing flexible, better for merit-based scholarships, or better to get into?
Yeah, so in general, use a school's acceptance rate as kind of your guidepost there, right?
Okay.
So if the school has an acceptance rate over 30%, they always have more scholarships available, and it will be easier for your student to get in. The one thing I will always say, this will always be true, public institutions are just not as good at gifters as privates. But if you're looking at your state universities, it also means that their starting price is not as high, right? The public institutions in Kansas and Missouri are some of the least expensive in the country. So there's some good opportunities there to keep your price low if your student's comfortable staying in that space and it meets the way that they learn, right? And it has their majors, right? Do all the other work too. Just make sure that you're including the financials, but don't make the mistake of leaning hard into the financial and then not thinking about academic and social fit too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. See another question here. Is the growth of homeschooling impacting admission, aid, or other trends decisions? Do homeschool kids need to consider any additional factors not typically mentioned or thought about?
Yeah, there are a few things. I don't see a ton of, I don't think it's making a difference, right? The volume of homeschool kids just on the overall impact of college. I think the same percentage of kids are going off to school. And in fact, with the exception of this kind of intermediate group of kids who are now applying who wouldn't have before, we kind of see percentages leaning into things like the trades, right? Which I think is all good. One of my kids did not go to college. I think kids should take the right path for them. Are there things that need to happen? Yes, there are some things that need to be demonstrated. A GPA needs to be formulated, for instance. And there are ways to do that. There's some really good resources. If you're part of a homeschool co-op, I'm sure they have those resources for you.
Yeah. A question here. Let's see. How do you approach the search process if the student doesn't know yet what they want to major in?
Yeah. I love this question because that's just about every kid.
Right.
Here's the way to think about it. Think about one, strengths of your student academically. What are their strengths? And then you want to seek out schools where they've got lots of majors in those academic areas, right? I also want to seek out schools where the school has a process in place to help your student figure that out. Some schools' processes, we don't have a process. You're going to wander around here until you figure it out. And if that takes you 6 years, I guess it does. Where other schools have a vested interest in getting you in and out in 4 years because they care deeply about their 4-year graduation rate. So they're going to help your student figure that out. So you want to make that part of your search criteria. Tell me, school, how are you going to help me figure that? And schools have different approaches to that. Some schools make it easy to double and triple major, which makes it easy for you to flow between majors without losing speed. I would like to ask schools things like, tell me about the graduation rate for kids who change their majors. What does that look like? So just ask better questions, go deeper. Yeah. Don't take their kind of surface level numbers, go a little bit deeper than that, and just presume that even if your student knows, I think parents really like wring their hands because your student doesn't know. The kids that sit in front of me and say, for sure, I'm going to be an engineer. Most of those kids, that is the number one changed major. Most of those kids don't end up being engineers.
Yeah.
So it's okay. It's okay to graduate. I think one of the best things parents can do is lighten the load off their students' shoulders by saying, it's okay if you don't know what you want to do yet.
Yeah.
Let's just look for schools that have lots of degrees in your academic strengths. Because if I'm terrible in science, but I'm a crazy good English person, I'm probably not going to be a chemistry major, right?
Right.
So you just want to look for degrees where there are lots of good uses of your students' talents and skills.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. Here's a FAFSA question. Will the new FAFSA format allow the parents' financial information to be hidden from the student? So that's a current complaint from a lot of high net worth families that don't want to reveal financial details unintentionally.
Yes, I understand that. The short answer is no,
Yeah.
it won't. Here's what I'll tell you though. We've certainly worked with families where that's a concern. I've yet to meet a student who went in and looked at their FAFSA form. They
Right.
they just don't.
Yeah.
They can barely find their pins to get the
Yeah.
sign thing done, right?
Yeah.
I would say in general, it's not such a big deal.
Okay.
And you certainly can, the way that the new FAFSA tries to address that is parents can fill it out in its entirety by themselves, create the signing for the student, they can create the pin for the student. Like you can do the whole thing now. So you wouldn't have to share that with your student if you didn't want to.
Nice. Yeah. Some other questions. Looking at the uh, you'd mentioned some projects or whatnot. So what type of projects as parent, what should parents be thinking of or trying to, I don't know if you want to say coach or kind of guide their kids of projects to look for, kind of those extracurricular things.
Yeah. So the style of projects that the more selective schools are interested in are typically not projects your student's going to spontaneously figure out on their own, is what I'll say. This is not about joining one more club. This is, I'll give you an example of a project one of our students did. She was bilingual because she had been in Spanish immersion since she was in kindergarten. She was working as a volunteer in the extended day program at her elementary school and talking to, she specifically worked with the ESL kids. In talking to the parents were talking about wanting her to tutor their kids because they were falling behind, and she was trying to figure that out. And it turned out that the ESL curriculum in their elementary school had not been updated in almost a decade. And so they were learning off old material. It didn't really align with what the teacher was teaching. And so her project, and she did happen to figure this out for herself, was, well, that's not right. So she recruited teachers and some parents and pulled together a project idea for updating the curriculum, pitched it to the school board. The school board gave it the seal of approval. They would pay for materials, but not time. So she had to, again, recruit all the volunteers, run and execute the transition into the new ESL program, which she did end to end. And with that project, she did get in test optional to the Huntsman program, which takes 50 kids a year at the University of Pennsylvania. So we have one kid who created an underwater submarine that does actual exploration in the ocean. So it's that, this is what I'm saying, like eyeball popping.
Yeah.
I would never have thought to spend my time doing these things, right?
Yeah.
We have one kid who created an NFT. We have one kid who created an app that you can go out now and download on the Apple Store or Google Store. It's that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Right. There are lots of ways to think about that and to align it with things that your kid is interested in. But I just want to be clear, it's not about like starting a new club at school.
Okay. Yeah. And then essays seem to be a decent portion of that merit-based aid there. And so do you have any tips or tricks for the parents of how to kind of help their kid work through that essay process?
Yeah, the key to the personal statement, which is the main essay kids have to write that goes along with the common application, is that it needs to be really narrow, very focused, and very personal. I always tell kids, think about writing it like you're telling the story to a friend, right? So it should be based in a value they hold close to their heart, right? Something that is a value they think of when they think of themselves. And then what's a story that demonstrates that value? But you want to tell the story not like you're writing a dissertation for your PhD, but rather like you're telling your pal a story, right? So it needs to be conversational. Most kids write it way too broad, like, on my mission trip, and don't write about your mission trip. On my mission trip, I learned that people in other countries are poor.
Mm.
Okay, congratulations. They
Yeah.
have read that essay so many times, they don't want to read it.
Yeah.
So you have to think about your audience. You've got to capture their interest in the first sentence or first two, or they are bypassing that essay and moving on, right?
Mm.
So that's the key, kind of.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's helpful. Great. Well, I know we're at time. Thank you so much, Cozy, for taking time out of your day to present this helpful information. We appreciate your work and your expertise in this area. And so, yeah, so stay tuned for Sound Stewardship to send a follow-up email with additional resources on the topic. And we'll provide a link to this recorded webinar. And yeah, just thank you so much, Cozy. Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Take care,
Yes.
everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.